We go. Good morning, everyone, and happy Tuesday. Thank you for joining us for our Tuesday edition of Coffee Talks. Today we have with us Marcus Fila, and he is going to help us talk about how we can manage improving our job design with less stress. So I'm sure we're going to continue to have people join, but we're going to go ahead and jump right in because I know that Marcus has a lot of great content. Good morning, Marcus. Welcome. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and give you the control. So
good morning. Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's great to see all of you. I don't know if any of you were at the conference last year. I had the privilege of speaking there. Can't believe it was a year ago. Had such a wonderful time. It's great to be here. This is a subject that I'm very passionate about. I'm going to cut right to the chase of what I think is the most important part of it. Just extremely briefly, you can tell from my accent, I grew up in the Grand Rapids, Michigan area. No, I'm from the UK. I've been over here 16 years now. I used to be a headhunter for Big Four accountants and IT and engineers, and I got into this subject based on what I saw working in those fields, sort of how moves were made and then what companies did to keep employees. So that really drove a lot of what I do my research in. I'm a management prof, as Jody said, but this is a big area of mine, and I also speak like I am now and consult companies about this as well. So let me share with you a PowerPoint that I have, and I would be super happy to go through just a few things with you and then go through absolutely any questions that you have about this. And I will try and make this as valuable to you as possible. Okay, there's some sun, which you were just saying we saw today, so that's a good positive way to start. Okay, I'm going to make some assumptions, which is that you're obviously here today because this is a subject that resonates with you in some way, but that if you're running a nonprofit or any organization, that there's some sort of work that needs to be done, and that some aspect of how, at least some of how it has been done, has changed due to COVID-19 and all of the adjustments that we've made around this. I'm also going to make what I think is quite a safe assumption, that you value the people that work with you and for you, and that you want to hang on to them, at least the ones that are good and productive and have a good attitude. And that you're right now probably feeling some tension yourself, and you're trying to motivate and to reassure people that work with you and for you in every way you can, because obviously a lot of the questions out there, as we all know, are very, the answers to them are very uncertain. So you're trying to take sort of something that you might not be sure about yourself and pass on an answer to people who are even less certain, and it's a very difficult thing to do. So it might not feel like it's enough. It might not feel like it's enough. So what I'm going to share with you today is probably what I consider the most important aspect of this entire area, and it's the one that is the best kept secret. I mean that. I'm not saying this tongue in cheek. I absolutely mean that. When it comes to work stress, occupational health, what tends to happen is there are a huge number of what I call sort of Bandaid interventions out there. So you imagine somebody running a company, they have employees, they know that those employees might be having issues, they know some of them might be down to the employees and personal differences that they have or other situations outside of work, but for the most part there's this balance between, well, here's our company and here's what we do and here's the job that they're doing, and how do we choose the right people for that job to really grow the chances that they'll be productive and able to do the job, and to reduce the chances that they won't be and that they'll want to leave or will want them to leave. So when you see any kind of issues, it's quite tempting to do these sort of interventions that act more like Band-Aids. And if you Google this whole subject, you'll see Forbes 7 ways to bust this, and it's all stuff. And many of these are very useful things to do. Doing yoga, going jogging, eat more greens, one of those things that you squeeze at your desk. Breathing exercises, taking short breaks, whatever it happens to be. I'm not downplaying those. Those can be very useful things to do. But what they tend to do is Band-Aid over the underlying issues that caused the problem in the first place. So what is the primary way to deal with this? Just general, I mean, COVID-19 aside for a moment, is job design. Is going back into the nuts and the bolts of what your employees are doing for you, and how they're doing it. And I'll talk about just sort of 3 or 4 of the, the main key areas to look at, and then I'll see what questions you have. So in a normal non-COVID-19 time, what I spend a lot of time doing is talking to people that run companies and sort of basically saying, look, this is the area, this is the way to get to the root of the problem, is to look at how the job is designed, in terms of a few different areas that I'll briefly go into. And then to sort of make a comparison between how it was done before and how it's being done now, and to pick the best parts of both. Now, COVID-19 is thrusting this upon us. COVID-19 has made most of us, if not all of us, have to work in a different way. And some of the ways can be very subtle. You might just be picking up your laptop and doing things from home, pretty much as you were doing in the office. But even then, there's going to be a lot of changes at the social level, at the identity level, that I'm going to talk about briefly. So there's sort of like, well, how things were being done before COVID was happening. And then there's, well, how are we doing things now? How are the people that are working for us doing things now? Question 3, I'm going to pose at you at the end here. But let me just get into a couple of these areas, and I want to see what questions that you have. I'm happy to help with anything. First of all, a couple of very basic things. An awful lot of subjects in life are sort of presented or argued as more of something is better, or less of something is better, or more of something is worse, or if you cut down on this, this is bad. When it comes to how demanding work is, there's a lot of science behind that. Basically, there's a sweet spot of how demanding work should be. If it's too high, consistently or acutely, then there's going to often be problems physiologically, psychologically, that can sort of come to bear. If it's too low, now the left side of this curve might not be as high up that side, but if it's too low, people can feel bored, underutilized, like their skills are atrophying, like they're going to waste. So that can also be very harmful too. The kind of demands people are looking for are ones that really challenge them and push them forward and help them grow, because obviously anyone who's proactive wants to keep growing. And then there's another whole set that I'm going to come on to in a minute that are ones we should try and avoid. So that's just a very basic framework there. So let's look at a couple of what we call resources that you can give workers that will really help them cope with whatever level of demands that they face. The big one, the major one, is control over how things are done. Now, you don't have to be a control freak to want to have some kind of level of control over how you make decisions, how you actually attack and do the tasks that you're doing. You want to, obviously, most people want to make some kind of, have some kind of participation in how some of the decisions around their job at least are being made, if not sort of beyond that, on a more of a departmental or company level. And then I think it's very important, a big signal of control is how much people are trusted. And what I see all the time, and I'm talking about in any kind of company really, but I see it particularly in professional service, for-profit companies out there, is that as soon as times get tough, as soon as the manager is feeling tension, then control that's given to the people below him or her just completely tightens up, and that just basically pushes a lot of that problem down. I've probably never given a talk on this subject without showing this figure. This figure is older than I am, but I keep bringing it up because it's got something really, really potent on it. Can you see that figure with everyone's screen over here? Basically, oops, let me just go back here. If you look at this axis down here, you see this is how much control people have. And up here, it's how demanding their work is. And the most sort of poisonous combination is for work to be highly, highly demanding, but for people to have no perceived control over how they do things. Okay, this works for heart disease, this works for depression, anxiety, pretty much any negative psychological or body-related outcome. Here's the interesting part on this though. Look at the top left. Look at the top left here where it says 2.8. So this is basically the number of people per 100 who have some kind of symptom in this. Look at this. Their demands are extremely high, but the control that they perceive that they have over their work is also very high. And look how much lower that poor outcome is then even when their demands are only moderate, but their control is low. So you see this 12.8 over here on the right. Okay, so in other words, if people are not even working that hard, if they're not being pushed that hard, but they perceive they have very little control over how they do things, that's actually worse for them than if you actually push them pretty hard, but you give them a lot of leverage over how things get done. Support is the other one. And this is and that comes from you as a supervisor or someone that works for you as a supervisor. In terms of the company as a whole, and now, the perception of how the company is supporting me. Obviously, there's the networks of colleagues, and the same figure here, but when control is higher, you see that the negative outcomes are less again. This is exactly the same combination, but when control is lower. So the real sweet spot here is actually if you can work people quite hard, expect a lot from them, but give them a lot of support, give them an awful lot of say over how they do it. And then you will get far less prevalence of things on average than if you don't. I think it's a good time to sort of think about if you take one job, or maybe there's a central job in your company and your nonprofit that people are doing, and just think of maybe the 3 biggest, most valuable tasks that they're doing for you as part of that job, the main things that they're doing. And it's like, are there ways that we could free up some autonomy for them, in a very practical way, to push them forward? And again, it's not about making work easier, it's about giving people the leverage to do that. Those are some of the basic things. There's just a couple of other things I want to cover with you, and then I want to see what questions you have. Some demands are very, very full, and there's no sort of curve linearity there. There's no NIGA where there's some sort of mid spot that's good. There tend to be things called hindrances. Now, this is stuff like, this is just stuff that gets in the way. This is red tape, paperwork that goes beyond what they absolutely have to do. Anything that basically prevents people from being able to hit the goals that they feel they like to hit or that they're trying to hit. Then there's a fairly sort of, let's say it's a new one. It's something that's been around since the dawn of time and the dawn of work, but really this is something that's come into play into discussions about this in the last 10 years. Although Harvard Business Review, that publishes tens of articles every day on work and job design, has only talked about this once so far, despite there being a lot of science behind it. This is task legitimacy, and this is a very simple question. Are the people that are working for you, again, COVID-19 or otherwise, are the people that are working for you doing the things that they believe someone in that job should be doing? That they believe someone in that job should be doing. In other words, you compare teachers, you compare friends, you compare all kinds of things, A to B, one to another. People obviously, if they've done the same kind of job somewhere else as they're doing now for you, they're going to be constantly subconsciously comparing, how the job breaks down, all the things I've already talked about, but they're going to be looking at, are there things here? Now, they might not be hard things to do. They might be things that people are happy, that don't seem to be too tough for them to complete, but it's just the thing of, are there things that people are expecting me to do that I should not be doing? So for instance, expecting a surgeon to change a bedpan, or expecting, a secretary or a PA in a legal firm to host the client the way an attorney would. It's not a fair expectation. And then there's some tasks that just tend to be busy work that really maybe nobody should be doing. So it's almost like just as you might do a disk cleanup on your computer, or you might take out the trash, it's like you go through the job description that people are doing in that central core job that they're doing for your company, your nonprofit. Are there tasks in there that, if you're honest with yourself, somebody else who has this job in that company, that nonprofit, wouldn't be asking them to do? They're not a sort of core part of this. And then those are things that we should deal with. The other two things, just very quickly, and then I'll get on to the last point, is role ambiguity, which is when people just sort of don't really know exactly where their role ends. Think of it like a pretty firm circle where there's a core set of tasks. People are very aware of what they should be doing, what it's down to them to do. But then around it, there's this sort of fuzzy, cloudy edge where people are not sure well, am I responsible for that? Is that something that I should be doing? Is that something that someone else should be doing? Am I going to be judged on this? How am I going to be judged on this? How could that potentially impinge on any progress that I want to make in terms of promotion or seen as doing good work, whatever it happens to be. So to be really kind of clear with people, almost in sort of an 8th grade way of what is expected of them versus what is not. So they absolutely know the boundaries. And then just role conflict, which is when there are 2 or more people telling you or telling this person what they should be doing, and they're not often telling them the same thing. So sort of like, you know, who is the one really that gets to set the tone of what they're doing? Okay, last point, then I want to turn it over to questions. This comes down to a word that might sound a bit fluffy and ephemeral, but actually is core to almost everything I can think of. This is identity. Okay, so we all have identities. I have an identity as a husband, as a father of a very busy 3.5-year-old. I have an identity as a college professor at home, as a management consultant, as a speaker, whatever it happens to be. Okay, the people that work with you and for you, and obviously so do you, have an identity in that field of work. So, you know, they have an identity as being an accountant, they have an identity as being a lawyer, they have an identity as being able to run or work in a non-profit in some kind of way. And some of that identity is wrapped up in them working specifically for you, for that organization. And some of that identity is broader than that and is more germane to actually that type of job, what they're doing. So I'm a professor at Hope College, but I'm also a professor beyond Hope College, if that makes sense, right? So part of that identity goes beyond where I'm working now. So violations to this identity, and again, I don't mean this to sound soft or fluffy, this is something that affects us all. If we feel that that identity is violated, the way your identity as a husband or wife, a father and mother would be violated, right? That can kind of dig very deep. That can dig very deep into the core of who we are. So if you lose your job, obviously, that's like pulling the plug out of the wall in terms of your identity, because you know that I do this for a living, I am this, and yet I don't have anywhere to do it anymore, okay? So obviously, if someone remains employed, but their work is changing an awful lot, then that identity could be violated as well. Now, we all want to be good sports and be flexible and adjusting to these COVID changes, but it's a big question worth thinking about. How much are we changing the identity of what people are actually doing for us based on all those things I've pointed out? One last point, then I'll take questions. If you want to protect that identity, people who remain hired but are now working from home, or there's some big changes in terms of how they're doing things, questions can be around. You're probably trying really hard to support them right now, but in what ways could maybe now be a good time to test their ability to take on more control of what they're doing in some ways? Again, think of those 2, 3, 4 core things they're doing for you. If you want to enhance them, and this is the juice in this talk at the very end, if you want to enhance them and therefore by their loyalty and their commitment when COVID finally goes away, okay, or embed that even further, help them shape the new normal when we come back. Because what I think is going to happen is we're going to come back, and I don't think everyone in every company is going to do things exactly the way they were done before, because people are going to have taken on so much more autonomy to do things a certain way, that now they're going to come back to the office or wherever they're working. Well, some of the changes we made actually really work well for us. I wonder what we could do to keep those. I wonder what we could do to keep those in terms of how we work when we get back at the individual level, the tasks, the job, and the organizational level. So I'll have a couple of wrap-up things to say at the end, but I hope that gives you 2 or 3 things to chew on, and I'd love to get your questions. If I haven't bored you completely to death in that short 20-minute time.
So far, no questions have come in. Does anybody want to ask their question live instead of typing it into the chat for Marcus? Marcus, I know that even just yesterday, in a conversation with Pete about the Community Foundation, and last week with Tamala, we talked about what things look like as we re-enter.
Yes.
And you've touched on that, and how we all will have, you know, we even just as we were chatting before you started your coffee talk, what normal used to look like isn't likely going to be the normal post COVID-19.
Right.
And as we look at easing into that new normal, any advice that you would give to everybody on this call as we know or plan to have something different in our job descriptions or our workload potentially?
Yeah, I think it's I think a good way to begin would be just to take those few points that I've raised about different kinds of demands, um, resources of control, and the different kinds of support, and then the things like the illegitimacy and the role clarity, and to actually sort of just map those down on a piece of paper. I know it sounds boring, but it will help get the conversation going, right? And almost share that with a trusted person that's working in your organization that's doing that job, okay? And say, how have these things, I mean, you could granulate it a lot further than this, but just as a way to get going, how have these things changed for you while you've been working from home or away, from here? And I think that a lot of people will probably intuitively come back in the first breath and say, well, my work's almost been the same, I've just been doing it from home. But then if you push them a little more gently into sort of, well, how have you been doing it? What's changed in some of the methods that you've been doing it, given that you've had more time, less time, you might have people running around. You've suddenly had a lot of time to contemplate what you're doing out of the office, and you've probably thought longer and harder about some of the ways you do things, right? So to actually start by breaking down those points and saying, right, how have the demands changed, or how have they been done differently? In what ways do you perceive that you might have actually had more freedom to do something? Because I've tried to support you as your manager, and now I've said, look, I need you to crack on with this. Come to me if you have questions. You know, just by saying that, you've given people a lot more freedom. So to actually have them specifically write down tangible ways that has changed. And again, it might take a minute or two to think of them, but almost, I mean, I'm not saying literally lock people in a room for a quarter of an hour and make them write something, but if you just really push people to think about these things, you'll see that certain things have changed. And what you don't want to do is to just lose that and have everyone come back and pretend that this never happened, because there's two reasons. The first reason is that, again, some people might have discovered some really cool or productive or just quality ways of doing the work that they do in this new way that we're going about things right now. And even though we want to get back to a normal, and even though we want to get back to where we work in terms of physical location, some of those ways are worth thinking about retaining. Maybe are ways that are working a lot better than they were before. Thinking about some of the ways that they might give you feedback about what conversations you've had with them to sort of empower them to do things a certain way, or to find a way to do them, or other ways that you've offered support that you wouldn't normally do it. And again, you might not be thinking about this, and they might not be consciously thinking about this now, but I bet you if you map these things out, talk about, people will actually have feedback on a good number of them. And then the question is, well, what do we keep? And if the answer is absolutely nothing, I'll be very surprised. I'm not saying it's impossible. But the other thing is, the other reason why you don't just want to not have this conversation and just basically throw away those changes is because if absolutely everything was better about how it was done before COVID-19, right, then that gives people a license to really appreciate it in a new way. Everyone's on mute except for me, which is probably not the right way around, is it?
Marcus, talk with us. We'll move off a little bit off topic.
Yeah.
Here. So I have been thinking about what it looks like to go back to physical presence of employees and returning to normal. For every individual, there is a different threat level, risk tolerance, level of concern. How do we handle the psychology of saying to folks that might have a high risk level and say, I don't really feel comfortable coming back to work physically because I feel like this virus is still a threat, or I don't want to. each of us is going to have to make decisions about where the approach we take, but I'm trying to think about the psychology of helping people, respecting people's level of threat and risk, and at the same time going back to some level of normal.
By the way, it's good to see you again. I can't believe it's been a year already. Yes, and almost as cataclysmically difficult as the decision was to close companies, to close universities, and to close churches, when to reopen is a harder question. The very point you're making. So at one end of the spectrum, it's like, right, we want everyone back in on May 15th or some date. And on the other end of the spectrum, it's, well, you just completely make your own choice, and we'll see you when we see you. And of course, you might have a scenario where people who have made the decision to come back earlier might feel impinged upon, but because it's not demanded of everyone. But then I think that might not be the case as well, Pete. I think that if you were to say to people who are doing good work for you, here's a range of dates, and we would like to see you by this time, but if you get to this fork in the road or this flagpole on the green and you still feel like it's too dangerous, then if you can just reaffirm or re-explain to me how you're doing the work you're doing at home, then I can give you a bit of leverage to come back. I mean, I think obviously if you force people to come back, then the resentment is going to be huge, and it could be a seed to turn over, and God forbid anyone gets sick, then the problems will be huge, not just for them. But I think there has to be, to give you a direct answer, I think there has to be a little flexibility, or I encourage a little flexibility in terms of when that is. So you could sort of have maybe 3 dates on the map and say, we would encourage you to come back by this date. If you don't feel like you can, if you feel like the risk is there, then here is a middle date. And of course, all this depends on what's happening. If it starts spreading again, then obviously we'll have to approach. But if it's dying down, and then here's a third date, which doesn't even have to be an absolute deadline. But then use those dates as checkpoints for the people who don't come back and say, right, let's at least have a discussion about how you're doing the work at home. So then each of those dates presents them with a choice, Pete. It's either they come back or they're accountable for what they're doing, and obviously a non-aggressive way. And then one can make a decision about if you're happy with that accountability. Does that give you something of an answer to that?
It does. So let me use Hope College as a case study.
Yeah.
Hope College chooses to have students return to campus, and you value in-person classroom interaction, and a quarter of the faculty say, we're not comfortable exposing ourselves and our families to all of these students who have returned. Mm-hmm. So we want to continue to teach virtually.
Right.
Now, it's much clearer if you have a food service worker who says, I want to work virtually in my food service role. And you say, well, that just doesn't work. But somewhere in the middle, you may have a registrar that says, I don't want students to have contact with me. I'm going to work virtually. And you say, well, we need to have the registration office open so that students can make classroom changes and course schedule changes. And we'd like someone to be here personally and physically to interact with those students.
Totally. And it's actually a question that our president is at Hope College is actually working through at the moment. I think if one tries to force an all or nothing scenario, then someone is going to get bent out of shape. So I think that, if you were to use Hope for an example, I think that, I would say you have the students come back, but then it's also about their comfort level as well, isn't it? Really you have two sort of, not employee groups, but two different groups of people that interact there on that level. So I think if it was something like a college and you had multiple sections of a course, you could offer a certain number of those continually online for people who didn't feel comfortable coming back, and you could keep some of them in person for people who do. That doesn't answer the question about how many buildings are open or how many dorms are open and all that sort of stuff. It's a huge logistical question. But I think you have a kind of set of fork in the road dates. And I think you have an optimistic date, you have a middle date, and then you have what you think might be a date towards the end for people who might have the least comfort about this. and it's like a kind of, I'm not going to push you beyond what you feel is your comfort level for coming back. And by doing that, by the way, it shows an enormous amount of trust in the employee. Wow, I'm actually trusted to make that decision for myself. Wow. And then, but with that is the accountability of, well, if you're going to be, and again, it's the key is in how you ask. I mean, you know, if you're going to continue working from home, and I guess an assumption I should have added to the first page of this talk is that I'm assuming that you're talking about work that can be done from home, not a food service worker, as you put it. If you're continuing to work from home, could you just reaffirm to me precisely how you're going to go about things versus here? And if you ask that in a kind of, well, justify why you're not coming back way, then people will get bent out of shape. If you ask that and look, I'd actually like to learn from you how it is your best practices are working out for you. You know, you've been operating from home now for some time. You don't feel comfortable coming back. Okay, fair enough. Can you teach, you know, what are some of the best practices that you found? And God forbid if this were to happen again, what could we learn from you about how to do it? And that will get them to answer the question of what they're doing with their time without making them feel like you're trying to micromanage them.
Marcus, thank you for answering those questions. We are currently at 10:30. I do have 2 questions in the chat, and out of respect for everyone's time, if you all need to drop off because it's 10:30, we totally respect that. I would like to give to you a couple questions that came into me privately. The first one, as it's related to your discussion around role and identity, given the unemployment crisis that the COVID-19 has created, how do we all navigate as a community those who are now on an unemployment and not working, and what can those who are working do to help them that we aren't currently doing?
Broadly speaking, I think it is worth break it down by industry or type of work, so that you're operating in those industry verticals. So what you could do is, if you are, say, an accountant who runs an accountancy practice, you could invite people who are unemployed accountants to reach out to you for the sake of just, frankly, just touching base with someone who's in that industry is going to at least relieve some of that tension, some of that ambiguity, and just have supportive conversations about, well, could there be options here when things get back to normal for you, without obviously making any promises you can't keep. But I think a big, but going back to the identity thing, Jody, it's a good question. Part of that identity in work is being able to talk and interact with people who do similar kinds of work to yourself. Okay. In fact, something that I'm looking to launch in the next 2, possibly 3 years is an online stress network called Stress Ally, where you're actually putting people together, employed or not, with someone else who is wiser and has had more years doing the same kind of work as that person has had. And actually, a lot of the problems in work are going to be either technical problems or relational problems that somebody who knows that industry better than you do is going to be more suited to answering than probably anyone else. Probably anyone at home could help you with. Probably, and again, I have a huge amount of respect for counselors, but counselors might not know your job specifically, so they could help you with general things very, very effectively. But so I think one thing as a sort of preemptive part to that is to just have people within an industry invite and open up and just be available for some time for people who are in that industry who've been laid off. You never know who you'll meet. You never know who could become a good future employee or employer. And that would be one way to go. I'm sorry, was there a part B to that question that I missed?
No, I think that you've answered that question.
All right.
So,
Of course, folks could always volunteer using our acts of service platform.
Yes.
And have meaningful, productive activity to be involved in, regardless of whether or not there's an income that is attached to it.
So that kind of segues right into the next question here. We have an organization that has seen a very little disruption in their need to continue to deliver services. But even prior to COVID, they were working on some reorganization of staff positions and duties. And now with COVID, some of that has certainly given them some new information to inform them differently, but they still want to move forward in the direction of that reorganization. Is this a good time to implement changes that don't really have anything to do with COVID? And the organization clarifies that they have been very engaged with their staff throughout this crisis, and most are working on site, not at home, with very few exceptions. So I think stripping that down, they were looking to do some restructuring to begin with that had nothing to do with COVID. Now COVID has happened. They've learned a few things, but still want to move forward with some changes. Is this a good time given the pandemic?
If they have already started going through that process of having conversations with their employees internally, then I think probably a staggered approach to that rather than an all-at-once approach would allow for sort of testing the waters. And I think it would be a case of sitting down and looking through all the different jobs in that organization that they're looking to change those lines of responsibility and those frameworks around, and maybe starting with one or two, perhaps one or two that are, when I say on the peripheries, I don't mean that they're not important. I mean that there might be only a small number of people doing it rather than the core job that 80% of your people are doing. And start with one or two of those and see how those changes might be playing out given COVID. And also kind of add a part B conversation to it, which is, and actually you could almost begin with this, given COVID, how have you found things changing for you? How might some of those changes that you found working the way you have done through COVID impact some of the things that we're talking about changing to now? I mean, it's a beautiful way to really tailor that in. So you have a part A and B conversation there. And then if those go well, then move on to maybe some of the more core roles in that organization that have a larger number of people doing them. I'm actually, I don't mean to give a shameless plug, but I'm actually starting in May and going into June, going to be doing some workshops with companies about doing exactly this, to sit down and go through a sort of an A and a B. The A is pre-COVID, the B is how people were working through COVID, around some of the frameworks I've shared with you, and obviously some other things. And then the C, the part 3 question is, okay, what are the best practices from both? How do we combine them? How do we move forward? And that's going to give them a better way of working going here on out. And God forbid, if anything happened like COVID again, it can give them something to jump back into very, very quickly. And they'll be sort of in a best place to learn from it.
Great. There are a couple questions that piggyback on top of each other that I don't want to dismiss here before we get to the end of our talk here today.
Sure.
Early on, there was a question about the role of the volunteer nonprofit board directing staff leadership in trying to navigate what a new normal looks like. And then later in the discussion, several people mentioned exactly doing what you've said, kind of that plan A, plan B, that staggered approach, using some of their internal staff and volunteers to create an outline or guidelines for what life looks like as we slowly re-enter this workforce. And I think that is a nice blend of having both the volunteers sort of inform that. I would say that, a strong board is a diversification of many professionals that you may not necessarily have on your staff, and that's why that board is a great support to the organization's mission. Any advice or insight that you would offer, Marcus, around that sort of integration or joint effort of what other organizations are doing, blending both staff and volunteer boards in that transition.
So sorry, again, so it's a blended approach between non-profit boards and
their staff, their professional staff.
And their professional staff. Okay. I think the first thing I'd suggest there is to be prepared to have discussions that might be to a broader audience than before. So if somebody is in a professional field, they'll have a sphere of people that they'll obviously be talking to day to day, week to week. And even if they were to get into sort of something like job design or these, during a non-COVID normal, quote unquote normal time, that sphere is only so big. I think now you have to add another layer onto that and go, right, okay, what is another layer or two of the onion here of people I can talk with that might have something valuable to say, because to a degree we've all got this shared experience happening now. We've all got something in common, which is we're going through this. So are there some best practices that might be something that we can learn from, or I can learn from, that go beyond that normal circle of people that I would talk to about this? My experience is that nonprofits and for-profits have got a lot more in common in some ways when it comes to how they run, strategy, differentiation, than I think a lot of people presume. So I think a lot of those subjects would be very germane if you would have crossed that non-profit-profit divide, as it were.
Great. Thank you, Marcus. Eric, to address your question head on here, wondering if others have a plan, protocols in place. Obviously, we all need to be very flexible. I think that just reading through this chat has given me some ideas of some future coffee talks that might be able to help all of us as we think about this re-entry and the changes that are going to take place just in our everyday lives, whether it's personal, professional, and really socially. So let us think about that a little bit and make sure that we can provide you all the tools, or at least some new information that can help us all navigate this new territory that we're getting ready to enter or re-enter, as we think about what's going to happen as life begins after COVID-19. So I think this is a great opportunity for us to stop. I again want to thank Marcus for giving us your time and expertise this morning, coming to us from the great state of Michigan, who is definitely under stricter guidelines these days than we are here in Indiana. But Marcus, I know you have a lot of final exams that you need to focus on, and we appreciate your time today. Everybody, thank you again for joining us. I continue to encourage you, if you have topics that you would like us to bring to the coffee talks, send us an email, let us know. We're open to trying to organize these so that they're meaningful for each and every one of you in your workplace. So until then, Thursday, we will have Marshall King talking to all of us about telling our story. This kind of folds into everything that Allie and Tamala were saying about new ways of fundraising, the right way to frame your story, telling that in a meaningful and impactful way for your donors. So please join us on Thursday afternoon as Marshall gives us tips on doing that. And until then, take care, everyone. Stay safe, and appreciate you being with us today. Bye-bye.
Take care, everyone. Sorry, I hope I answered the questions decently there.